Good afternoon on today's Angry Bulletin. For some time now, this has been NASA's plan for putting human beings back onto the moon, docking Lunar Starship with the Lunar Gateway after the Orion capsule has dropped off astronauts to the Gateway, and then for Lunar Starship to bring those astronauts down to the lunar surface and then ultimately return them to the Gateway. However, a recent report from the Government Accounting Office has confirmed that it's very unlikely that this sort of rendezvous is ever going to happen. It appears that Lunar Starship, as huge as it is going to present a bit of a threat to a tiny space station like Lunar Gateway. So some changes are going to have to be made in the Artemis plan at this late hour, and none of those changes look very good for our return to the moon. All of this, plus an incredible announcement, the first time that I'm making an announcement like this and more, coming to you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon and welcome to another Angry Bulletin. We are going to be talking a bit about NASA's recent decisions and some of the consequences that these decisions are going to have on the Artemis program. But before we get to that, I need to tell everybody that I'm going to be coming back to America for a little while. And the reason for that is this time is not a family crisis as before, but instead something I've never gotten an opportunity to do. NASA has granted me a press pass to the Crew 9 launch that's going to be sending a new crew rotation, as most of you probably know, to the International Space Station. This is going to include a behind-the-scenes tour, an opportunity to interview the astronauts personally, just a huge opportunity, and of course, covering the launch as well. I have never had an opportunity like this, certainly not afforded to me by NASA in the past. It seems that they have finally decided to give me a chance to cover one of their events, and I'd like to thank my friends at Sierra Space who made a lot of that possible. They were the ones who really introduced me to the NASA PR people and emphasized that I would be a worthwhile journalist to include at some of their events, and apparently NASA took their words to heart. So here's the deal. As always, I am going to need a little support in order to get back to the Cape, hotel expenses, and also I'll be taking a fair amount of equipment with me, so the airlines are going to charge me some fees in order to bring some checked bags. And I know you guys have been very generous to me in the past. I wouldn't ask this if it wasn't such a huge event, which, by the way, I'm going to go regardless. But as I say, I could definitely use the help given how much I've had to travel across the Atlantic for a variety of different reasons lately. If it's something you'd like to consider, all the details in the description. Okay, enough of that. Let's go ahead and get on to what's happening with Artemis, Lunar Starship, and Lunar Gateway. For those of you who have been watching my channel for some time, you know very well that this is the human landing system solution that I always thought was the best for Artemis. It is a small spacecraft, a reusable spacecraft. It requires only 2 launches, not 11, to get it to the moon, and it's just well suited to a program that never intends to put any more than 4 astronauts on the lunar surface, at least not for the first 10 missions or so. But as we all know, NASA decided to go with this option, a much bigger, much more ambitious solution, something that definitely will be able to do some amazing things on the moon, including building cities, for example, or deploying large-scale lunar mining operations. I mean, Starship is definitely the long-term solution to establishing large human colonies and a permanent human presence, not only on the moon, but throughout the solar system. However, recently, the Government Accounting Office has discovered that this is a horrible solution for Artemis, simply because Artemis was never designed to build cities on the moon or to build large-scale mining operations. Instead, it was supposed to put small-scale research stations, a permanent presence granted, but only with about 4 astronauts at a time, and actually starting out with only 2 astronauts, and it had a space station to meet these requirements, the Lunar Gateway. Lunar Gateway, in many ways, is actually a bit too small even for Artemis's purposes, and this is because the initial modules for the Gateway are designed to be carried by a Falcon Heavy. The original plan was to install the modules via an SLS, which has a much larger fairing and a much heavier carrying capacity, but as budgets became tighter and tighter, Falcon Heavy was pigeonholed into this position, and frankly, I don't think it can handle everything that the Lunar Gateway requires. Consequently, the habitation modules like Halo and IHAB are too small for astronauts to really be able to effectively do their work. Now, before we talk about all the problems here, let's go ahead and cover the steps in an Artemis mission. We'll talk about Artemis 4 because Artemis 3 is not supposed to have the Lunar Gateway involved. In theory, Artemis 3 will happen before the Gateway is even deployed. And by the way, the animation that you're watching right now is created by the incomparable Hayzegrayart. I'm not going to show you the whole animation here, plus it's got some incredibly cool music. If you want to see that, you got to go to his YouTube channel, which I have linked in the description. So, step 1. NASA launches the power and propulsion element and the habitation and logistics outpost, or HALO, modules of the Gateway together. The modules transit together to a near rectilinear HALO orbit orbiting the moon. Now keep in mind, both these modules are being contained inside the fairing of a Falcon Heavy, so they're very, very small. We'll talk a little bit more about them in a second, but first of all, we need to talk about their orbit. The reason that NASA is going for this extremely elongated orbit is for fuel efficiency. Orion does not have the fuel or the delta V necessary to descend to low lunar orbit and then return successfully to Earth. So this orbit allows Orion to rendezvous with the Gateway when it's substantially closer to the Earth than it would be otherwise, and then the Gateway carries the astronauts and the human landing system to a location that is much closer to the lunar South Pole before dropping them off, and then the Lunar Gateway will eventually orbit back to a position where it can pick them up later. It's essentially using this orbit to take care of a lot of the delta V required to get the astronauts down to the moon. It's actually a pretty good plan when it comes to fuel efficiency, and it's actually absolutely necessary because Orion can't get to a lower orbit on its own anyway. Okay, so step 2. SpaceX again launches another Falcon Heavy with the Dragon XL on board, and it transits to the near rectilinear HALO orbit and docks with the Gateway as well, and this contains all the necessary supplies, food, consumables, additional atmosphere, etc. for the astronauts on the Gateway during their stay, which is going to become more and more lengthy with every mission until the astronauts are spending up to 3 months on the Gateway at a time. And by the way, Hayzegrayart seems to have a really good understanding of how all of this works because he starts off this animation with Dragon XL docking with the Lunar Gateway before anything else docks with it. So let's move on to step 3. Now, step 3 has very little to do with the Gateway itself. Instead, it has a lot to do with Lunar Starship. SpaceX launches a depot to low Earth orbit, and then SpaceX launches several tankers, which delivers fuel to the depot. Once the depot accumulates sufficient fuel, the Human Landing System Starship launches and docks with the depot for fuel transfer. And after the Human Landing Starship is finished, it decouples from the depot and transits again to near rectilinear HALO orbit to rendezvous and dock with the Gateway. So far, so good, but we're going to run into some problems here very soon. Now, when Step 4 comes around, NASA is finally launching SLS and the Orion. We've done a lot of things before we finally get to the Orion launch. It has 4 crew on board, and in addition to that, it has another component for the Gateway on board, the International Habitat, or the IHAB, and that's being contained inside the Universal Service Adapter, which Dynetics is currently building. And by the way, I've seen this stage adapter, and it is enormous, definitely large enough to carry a very robust habitation module to the Gateway. So after this is done, on its way to the moon, Orion separates from the launch vehicle upper stage and then docks directly with the IHAB, which is still connected to the upper stage, as you're going to see here in just a moment. The IHAB then separates from the upper stage, the exploration upper stage as it is called, with 4 RL-10 engines as opposed to the 1 RL-10 that SLS currently has on the ICPS upper stage. And then once this separation is complete, the IHAB then is docked, as we said before, with the Orion, and then the Orion can tug the IHAB to near rectilinear halo orbit. So what we have here is a mission that can both deploy a module of the Lunar Gateway space station and carry astronauts to the moon all in the same launch, finally making SLS a little bit more cost-effective, but still ridiculously expensive. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is NASA's not 100% certain that this is going to work out. If there is some kind of problem with the Universal Stage Adapter, then we need to look at alternatives to get the IHAB out to the moon, and once again, that's Falcon Heavy, which means IHAB has been designed to work with Falcon Heavy if need be, meaning that it is tiny also. So let's get on to stage 6. In this stage, Orion docks the IHAB with the rest of the Gateway. The crew enter the Gateway and they activate the IHAB, which is powered by the Gateway's solar panels. Orion then stays docked with the Gateway for a total of about 17 days, and during that time, Starship brings the astronauts down to the lunar surface, and you have 1, perhaps 2 astronauts staying behind on the Lunar Gateway carrying out other tasks. And so after the crew conducts lunar surface operations, including moonwalks to collect science samples during their estimated 6-day stay, the HLS Starship ascends back to the near rectilinear halo orbit where it docks with the Gateway, and then after that the crew transfers science samples and the crew themselves to the Orion for return to Earth. The crew enter the Orion and of course make that journey. So that takes care of the entire plan. A little complicated and involving quite a few different types of spacecraft and a space station besides, but it gets the job done, at least in theory. But here's the problem. Lunar Gateway is far too small for Lunar Starship. It cannot effectively dock with it, or to be more precise, Starship cannot dock with Lunar Gateway. In an unbelievable oversight, it turns out that Starship is just too big to dock with this tiny space station. If it were docked with it, it would affect its ability to stay in the correct orbit and to orient itself in space, and this would disrupt communications with Lunar Gateway and also make it impossible for other vehicles to dock. Starship's mass is actually 18 times the acceptable value for orbital station controllability. So why is this the case? Well, it's because the power and propulsion element provides the necessary thrust and control for the Lunar Gateway, and that makes use of a very powerful ion engine. It's driven actually by solar electric propulsion. Very efficient, far more efficient than chemical engines, utilizing an easily ionized fuel such as krypton or xenon, and then driving that ionized fuel through an electromagnetic field. However, you don't get a lot of thrust out of ion engines, even big ones on the PPE. That being the case then, if you have a very large ship docked with Gateway, such as Lunar Starship, it's not going to be able to maintain control of the space station with such a huge amount of mass attached to it, even though the PPE already is meeting the requirements for stack controllability that NASA set in the first place. Here's the deal. When the Lunar Gateway was originally designed, nobody thought that a vessel as heavy as Starship would actually be docking with it. Once again, we're not just talking about 100 metric tons worth of stainless steel. Starship has to carry a considerable amount of propellant and oxidizer on board in order to safely carry the astronauts all the way down to the lunar surface and then to return with them. It's a lot of mass, and the current design for Lunar Gateway can't handle it. One of the possible solutions is to coordinate the thrusters on Starship to help provide the necessary control, but of course, combining chemical thrusters with ion thrusters is probably going to create a pretty complicated control solution, one that may never really be practical. Again, very difficult to believe that NASA actually chose to go with a massive ship like Starship without anticipating that something like this could happen. So there's a couple of really easy solutions, obviously. Go with a different HLS solution, or get rid of Lunar Gateway and replace it with a different space station. Now, I'm sure that most of you SpaceX enthusiasts are yelling at the TV screen right now and saying, just use another Starship. Use Starship as the Lunar Gateway and use that as the replacement. You don't need Lunar Gateway. You don't need anything except Starship. Well, there are some significant problems with that solution. Problem number one, Lunar Starship is designed to take a couple of astronauts down to the surface, or maybe 4 astronauts, keep them there for about a week and then return them. And its life support system is designed with that function in mind. If you want instead to use it as a space station that's going to stay in lunar orbit for weeks or perhaps even months at a time with a crew on board, you're going to need to design a much more resilient life support system than Lunar Starship currently has. Now, maybe that can all be done, that's fine. However, it's going to cost additional money that's already been invested in Lunar Gateway, but there's a much bigger problem than that. Lunar Starship is huge and heavy. And it's going to remain huge and heavy because if you make it into a space station, it's still going to have its fuel tanks, it's still going to have all of those Raptor engines, all of these things that are going to add permanent and frankly useless mass to this vehicle as it tries to function as a space station. And you're going to have to keep it in that near rectilinear halo orbit for 15 years. How are you going to do that with chemical thrusters? In other words, the types of maneuvering thrusters that are on Lunar Starship right now. Propellant boil-off and other factors are going to cause Lunar Starship to no longer be maneuverable until perhaps 2 or 3 years after being deployed. Only an ion engine is going to be able to keep Starship in the proper orbit for a sustained period. But you're going to need enormous ion engines in order to be able to maneuver something as big and heavy as Starship. And adding all those additional engines, assuming it could even be done, is going to be a very expensive and lengthy process, to say the least. Now, perhaps you could set up some sort of propellant boil-off mitigation system, but then you're essentially trying to turn Lunar Starship into a refueling tanker. So many different functions that you're trying to pile onto this ship in order to turn it into a space station. It's going to be expensive, it's going to be difficult, and at this stage, so late in Lunar Gateway's development, it's not going to be all that efficient. So what's our other alternative? Well, to make use of perhaps the backup HLS system from Blue Origin, that also is a horrendous idea because that HLS system is still in its infancy. It's probably going to be 10 years before Blue Moon is actually going to be ready to land on the moon with astronauts in tow. If NASA had just chosen an effective and mostly developed concept, in other words, Alpaca, that passed its preliminary design review way back in 2021, we would be in a much better position right now. But unfortunately, we aren't. And now, NASA's going to have to play a lot of catch-up on this and try to come up with a way to pound a square peg into a round hole with this Starship plus Lunar Gateway solution. Perhaps it can be as simple as just docking Starship directly with Orion and taking those crew members down to the lunar surface, and then whatever crew members remain behind dock with the Lunar Gateway just on Orion, and then reverse the process when Lunar Starship comes back up. It adds more complexity and an additional step, or rather 2 additional steps to the overall process, but at least it could get the job done. Again, though, difficult to believe that NASA allowed this to fly under their radar for so long. I mean, it's been years since they selected Starship HLS, and they never took into account whether or not Elon Musk's vessel that was supposed to colonize Mars would fit smoothly and efficiently into their design for establishing a permanent presence on the moon. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And once again, please check the description for various ways to support my upcoming trip to Cape Canaveral. And as always, stay angry about space.